The sun was setting, painting the sky in soft orange and pink as the general drove home after a long day at the veteran hospital. He had spent hours visiting soldiers recovering from injuries, talking to families and offering support to those who had given so much for their country. The drive back was meant to be quiet, a moment of peace before returning to his demanding schedule. His uniform was neatly pressed, his medals polished, and the pride of his service carried quietly in his demeanor. Despite the weight of responsibility he carried every day, he felt a rare calm, enjoying the gentle hum of the car and the fading sunlight on the road. He was a man who had dedicated decades to his country, rising through the ranks with hard work, strategy, and an unyielding commitment to his team and the people he served. He had faced danger, made difficult decisions, and trained countless soldiers to be strong, disciplined, and focused. Yet tonight he was simply a man on his way home, looking forward to a quiet dinner and the comfort of routine. As he drove, a police car appeared in his rearview mirror, its lights flashing briefly before turning them off again. At first he thought it might be another car on the road or a routine patrol, but soon the car started following him more closely. The officer signaled him to pull over. The general complied immediately, moving to the side of the road. He turned off the engine, placed his hands on the wheel, and waited. He had no reason to fear the law. He had always respected it, and his life had been a testament to discipline and order. The officer approached his car, flashlight in hand, and asked for his identification. The general calmly reached for his wallet and handed over his license, along with his military ID, which clearly identified him as a high-ranking officer. He spoke with a steady, even voice, explaining that he had just come from visiting a hospital and was on his way home. The officer barely looked at the credentials. His tone carried a hint of impatience and something more subtle, something the general could sense but didn't react to immediately. It was an assumption, a bias that had nothing to do with the facts he had just presented. The general remained calm. He had learned long ago that anger and frustration did not serve him, even in situations where injustice seemed obvious. He simply asked again if the officer would verify his identification and record his credentials properly. Instead of cooperating, the officer stepped back slightly and made a comment that was unnecessary and pointed. The general listened without responding. He was not a man to argue over insults, especially in a situation where the law could be enforced against him at a moment's notice. He had learned patience in some of the harshest circumstances in the world. As the conversation continued, another officer arrived. This one seemed more aggressive from the start, taking a harsher tone and questioning why the general was driving suspiciously, despite clear evidence to the contrary. The general tried to explain again, keeping his voice calm, stating his purpose and presenting his credentials. But the second officer ignored him, stepping closer, invading the small space around the car as if to intimidate him. The tension in the air grew. Passers-by on the street began to notice the interaction. Some slowed their cars, others walked closer to see what was happening. The general's calm demeanor and professional presentation stood out sharply against the officer's aggressive behavior. People started recording the scene on their phones, capturing every detail of the interaction. Despite the escalating tension, the general remained composed. He understood the importance of staying in control, even when those around him were not. He was trained to handle high-pressure situations, and this, although frustrating and unfair, was a situation he could navigate with clarity. He continued to respond politely, offering facts, showing his identification, and asking for verification. Every word he spoke was measured, calm, and precise. The first officer finally stepped back, glancing at his partner who seemed to be getting frustrated with the general's calmness. There was a clear divide between the general's behavior and the assumptions the officers were making. One of them, perhaps feeling threatened by the general's composure, decided to escalate the situation. They began to insist that he step out of the vehicle and submit to further questioning. The general, knowing his rights and aware of his position, asked for clarification. He requested to see a valid reason for such actions and reminded them of his military service and current rank. The officers, blinded by prejudice and a rush to judgment, ignored the context and continued with their aggressive approach. The general's presence, normally commanding respect, seemed to provoke hostility rather than acknowledgement. As the interaction continued, the crowd outside grew slightly larger. Neighbors and people who happened to be walking by sensed something was wrong. They could see a man, calm and dignified, being treated as if he had committed some crime he didn't commit. The general's restraint, however, was not a sign of weakness. It was a signal of his experience and the wisdom that comes from years of service and discipline. He noticed the frustration building in the officers. He could see the impatience in their body language, the tight grip on their flashlights, and the quick, sharp movements that suggested they were ready to act before thinking. The general understood that the situation could quickly escalate if he did not remain steady. He took a deep breath and reminded himself that anger would only worsen the situation. Instead, he focused on clear communication, patience, and calm persistence. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one officer suggested that they would need to take him in for further verification. The general's heart sank momentarily, not out of fear but out of disbelief. Even after showing identification, remaining polite and explaining his actions, the officers were ready to make a serious mistake based on bias rather than fact. He stayed calm and cooperative, understanding that resistance could escalate the situation dangerously. The general was guided to the patrol car, his hands raised as a precaution, but still calm and unafraid. The officers, focused on their assumptions rather than reality, did not notice the crowd that had grown larger, all recording, watching, and beginning to question the officers' actions. The general kept his mind clear, thinking several steps ahead. He knew he had the training to handle tense moments, and he also knew that the truth was on his side. As he was placed in the back of the police car, he remained silent, observing, noting the behavior of the officers and keeping his composure. Every detail mattered. He knew that one misstep could lead to unnecessary escalation. Yet he also understood that the officers' arrogance and bias had already created a moment that could not easily be forgotten. The general looked out the window, seeing people watching, their expressions a mix of concern and disbelief. Some waved, others simply recorded. He acknowledged them subtly, not as a display but as a silent signal that he was okay and that he remained in control. The crowd's presence was a quiet support, a reminder that injustice often draws attention, even if it begins unnoticed. Inside the patrol car, the officers whispered to each other, clearly frustrated that the situation was not going as they expected. The general, sensing their irritation, remained calm. He had faced high-pressure situations where lives were at stake, and this, although wrong and humiliating, required only patience and clarity. He prepared himself mentally for the next steps, understanding that a phone call could quickly shift the balance. The general's mind worked quickly, noting every detail and planning his next move. He knew that being calm was not enough. He would need to use his authority wisely but with dignity to correct the injustice. He also knew that this moment would not define him, but it would reveal the character of those around him. Even as the officers continued their biased assumptions, the general's presence remained steady, composed, and professional. He did not argue, did not raise his voice, and did not show anger. His calmness in the face of unfair treatment became a quiet form of resistance, a demonstration of strength that required no words. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the street bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. The general remained in the patrol car, aware of the crowd outside, the officers' tension, and the unfolding situation. He prepared for the next step, knowing that his experience, training, and position would soon make a difference, even if the officers could not see it yet. In that quiet moment, the general's thoughts were clear. He had faced danger, disrespect, and prejudice before, and he would handle this with the same unwavering composure. He would let the truth and his authority speak for themselves. And as the car waited to move, he remained ready, knowing that patience, clarity, and a steady mind would guide him through the night. The patrol car slowly rolled toward the station, the general sitting quietly in the back seat, his hands resting calmly on his knees. The officers in the front whispered to each other, their voices sharp and tense, occasionally glancing at the rearview mirror to make sure he stayed in place. The general paid them no mind. He knew that reacting to their aggression or bias would only escalate the situation. He had faced hostile environments before, where quick thinking and patience were the only tools for survival, and he applied that same approach here. The ride felt longer than it was, stretching into an uneasy silence. Outside, the fading sunlight was replaced by streetlights casting a dim glow through the car windows. Occasionally, he caught sight of people on the sidewalks, some still watching, some recording the scene with their phones. He could see the confusion and concern on their faces, and he acknowledged it subtly with a nod, a quiet reassurance that he was unharmed and in control. He drew strength from their presence even though he did not speak. Once they arrived at the station, the general remained calm as the officers guided him out of the car. He had been handcuffed, but the cuffs were not tight enough to cause discomfort, and he allowed himself a controlled sigh. He knew that showing fear or agitation would do nothing but feed the officer's misplaced sense of authority. He reminded himself silently that dignity in the face of injustice often speaks louder than words. Inside the station, the atmosphere was heavy with tension. The general was led to a holding area, a small room with fluorescent lighting and hard benches. The walls were plain, and the air smelled faintly of cleaning products mixed with anxiety. Other detainees sat quietly in the corners, their expressions wary, while officers moved about briskly, seemingly eager to finish paperwork and return to their routine. The general's presence, however, altered the usual flow. Even in his silence, there was an air of authority, a quiet command that made some officers pause and reconsider their actions. He remained seated, keeping his posture straight and his gaze calm. He noticed small details, the ticking of a clock on the wall, the distant chatter of officers, the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Every detail mattered. He had learned in the military that awareness and observation could prevent mistakes and protect oneself in unexpected situations. Here, in a seemingly ordinary holding room, those lessons were just as relevant. After a few minutes, one of the officers approached, clipboard in hand. His tone was condescending, almost mocking, as he repeated the reason for the arrest, a fabricated allegation that made no sense. The general listened without interruption, nodding politely, his voice steady when he finally spoke. He calmly explained that the accusation was false, that he had committed no violation, and that his identification clearly showed his rank and service. The officer, frustrated by the lack of reaction and the quiet authority of the general, muttered under his breath but did not argue further. The general realized that to resolve this, he would need to take the next step carefully. He had resources at his disposal, contacts who could verify his identity instantly, and the authority to make it clear that the arrest was a serious mistake. He requested permission to make a phone call. The officer, unaware of the general's full rank, hesitated but allowed it. The general's calm and polite request contrasted sharply with the officer's suspicion and bias, making the situation feel even more absurd. Using a colleague's phone, he dialed the Pentagon. Each number was deliberate, precise, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. On the other end, an assistant answered, recognizing the voice immediately. The general explained the situation succinctly, detailing the wrongful arrest and the officer's refusal to verify his credentials. Within moments, the Pentagon's tone shifted from routine to urgent. They immediately contacted the local police command, emphasizing the general's rank, service, and the need for his immediate release. Back in the station, the officers grew visibly tense. They were suddenly aware that the man they had treated with disrespect was no ordinary individual. The general remained composed, observing the shift in their demeanor. He did not gloat or raise his voice. He simply maintained his calm, letting the weight of truth and authority correct the imbalance. The officers were caught between their bias and the reality of the general's position, unsure how to proceed. Meanwhile, the general's quiet dignity had not gone unnoticed by others in the station. Some officers began to exchange nervous glances, realizing that their behavior could have serious consequences. Passers-by who had recorded the incident began sharing the videos, and within a short time, local news outlets and social media platforms started picking up the story. The general, aware of this, did not let it distract him. He knew that the truth, combined with his composure, would soon speak louder than any video or rumor. The atmosphere shifted further when a senior officer arrived, summoned by the Pentagon's urgent message. The general explained the situation again, calmly and clearly, providing all necessary identification. The senior officer, now fully aware of the general's rank and the mistake that had been made, immediately instructed the release of the general. Apologies were requested, protocols reviewed, and the local officers who had acted on bias were suddenly under scrutiny. Throughout this, the general remained composed, demonstrating a quiet strength. He knew that reacting with anger or frustration would have undermined the authority he now held in this situation. His calmness highlighted the contrast between his professionalism and the officer's initial misconduct. He had been trained to handle life-and-death situations, and this incident, though unjust, was handled with the same precision and discipline. As he was led out of the holding area, people who had been watching and recording the situation outside offered nods and words of encouragement. The general acknowledged them, not as a display of pride but as a recognition of shared humanity. In that moment, he understood that this incident was larger than himself. It was a reflection of societal issues, biases, and the importance of accountability. Yet he also understood that his response could set an example of leadership, restraint, and dignity. The officers who had initially arrested him were visibly embarrassed, their earlier confidence replaced by nervousness and regret. They had acted on assumptions rather than facts, and the consequences of their actions were now clear. The general, however, did not dwell on their mistakes. His focus remained on resolving the situation calmly and professionally, ensuring that justice was served without unnecessary conflict. The Pentagon officials stayed on the line, ensuring that the general's release was handled smoothly. They confirmed that all procedures were followed and that the officers involved would be reviewed for their conduct. The general's calm and professional demeanor, combined with the authority of his position, had turned what could have been a dangerous and humiliating situation into a moment of accountability and correction. As he walked back to his car, free from the handcuffs and the unjust treatment, the general reflected on the incident. He knew that the officer's bias had led to a wrongful arrest, but he also knew that his patience, discipline, and measured response had prevented escalation. He understood that anger would have made the situation worse, but calm authority and clarity of purpose had brought resolution. The people who had been watching, some still recording, now saw a man who had been wronged, yet handled the situation with dignity and strength. Their admiration was quiet but sincere. They understood that true leadership is often shown not in moments of triumph, but in how one handles injustice and adversity. The general's example would linger in their minds long after the incident, a reminder that calm, measured action can overcome bias and ignorance. Back in his car, the general started the engine, taking a deep breath as he prepared to continue home. The sunset had fully faded, leaving the night sky above. He drove carefully, aware that the evening had left a mark not just on him but on everyone who had witnessed the events. The officer's actions would not be forgotten, and neither would his response. He thought about the veterans he had visited that day, remembering their courage and resilience. Their struggles reminded him why patience, respect, and professionalism mattered so much. If he had reacted differently, if anger had taken hold, the incident could have escalated dangerously. Instead, he had maintained control, demonstrating that leadership is shown through action, composure, and the careful exercise of authority. The general's phone buzzed briefly. Messages of support from colleagues and other officials began to arrive. He read them quietly, acknowledging the solidarity without becoming distracted. The incident had already begun to ripple outward, a reminder of the importance of accountability and respect, and the consequences of bias and assumption. As he drove into the quiet streets near his home, the general reflected on the night's events. He understood that change often begins with small actions, with calm responses in the face of prejudice. He also knew that his example, visible to many, would serve as a lesson in dignity, patience, and the power of authority exercised responsibly. The night settled fully around him, and the general finally allowed himself a small sigh of relief. He had navigated an unfair and tense situation with composure and clarity. The officer's bias had been confronted, Corey. The general sat in the small interview room, the air thick with tension. The fluorescent lights above hummed quietly, casting a sterile glow over the walls. The room was empty except for the table, 2 chairs, and a single officer standing near the door. His hands rested calmly on the table as he waited, eyes focused and clear. He had been through countless high-pressure situations in his career, battlefields, strategic meetings, and crisis management. But this, in its own way, required the same kind of control. The officer finally spoke, repeating the accusation that had led to the arrest. The general listened quietly, nodding slowly as if considering the words, though he knew they were baseless. He responded with calm precision, correcting the misunderstanding and providing his credentials once again. He emphasized that he was a high-ranking officer with years of service, explaining that a simple verification call could resolve everything immediately. The officer hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, unsure how to handle a situation that had quickly grown beyond his control. He glanced at his partner, whose expression mirrored his own: frustration, uncertainty, and a hint of fear. The general remained composed, speaking slowly and deliberately, each word measured. He had learned long ago that patience, calmness, and clarity often outweighed aggression or anger. When the officer finally left the room to make a call, the general used the quiet moment to observe. He noticed the small details: the scuffed floor tiles, the way the walls seemed to close in, the faint smell of cleaning fluid mixed with anxiety. Each detail mattered. In his career, awareness had saved lives, and even now, it kept him prepared for any unexpected turn. He remained silent, collecting his thoughts, aware that the next moments could shift the situation entirely. After a few minutes, the officer returned, phone in hand. His expression had changed, a mixture of uncertainty and recognition. He explained that they had spoken with someone who verified the general's identity, though he spoke cautiously, still unsure how to handle the reality of their mistake. The general nodded politely, his tone calm and neutral, avoiding any hint of triumph or anger. He understood that professionalism in moments like this was more powerful than words of reprimand. The general requested a direct line to the Pentagon, knowing that further confirmation from higher command would settle the matter completely. This time, the officers complied without hesitation. He dialed with steady fingers, the phone's tone echoing slightly in the small room. When the line connected, a familiar voice answered, instantly recognizing him. He explained the situation in clear, concise terms, detailing the wrongful arrest and the officer's initial refusal to verify his credentials. On the other end of the line, the Pentagon's response was immediate. The assistant quickly put him through to a higher-ranking official, someone with the authority to intervene directly. Within moments, the tone of the conversation changed from routine to urgent. The general calmly outlined the events, remaining composed, and the official listened intently, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. Back in the station, the officers could feel the shift. Their earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by a tense awareness of the general's authority and the seriousness of their mistake. The room seemed smaller somehow, the walls closer, the air heavier. The general remained seated, hands folded, watching as the officers struggled to process the sudden turn of events. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with their growing unease, making the disparity between his professionalism and their bias even more obvious. The general explained to the Pentagon official that he had been treated unfairly due to assumptions about his race, and that his credentials had been ignored. The official's voice carried authority as they instructed immediate action, contacting the local police command and ensuring the general's release. Within minutes, orders were transmitted back to the station, and the atmosphere shifted once more. The officers who had moments ago acted with arrogance and bias now moved cautiously, aware of the serious consequences of their actions. While the formalities unfolded, the general remained composed. He did not gloat or express anger. His focus was on resolution, on ensuring the situation ended with clarity and justice. He understood that demonstrating patience and restraint was more impactful than confrontation, and he embodied that principle fully. As the Pentagon confirmed his release, the officers were directed to provide a formal apology and to review their conduct. The general listened calmly as they issued words that were clearly uncomfortable for them. He accepted the apology without hesitation, knowing that acknowledgement of wrongdoing, even grudgingly given, was a step toward accountability. He maintained his dignity throughout, a quiet signal that true leadership often requires measured responses rather than emotional reactions. Outside the station, the general could hear the faint hum of people who had gathered earlier. Some were still recording, some were whispering to one another, and some simply watched from a distance. The public attention added pressure to the officers, who were now fully aware that their actions had been documented and would be scrutinized. The general's presence, calm and authoritative, contrasted sharply with their earlier aggression. reinforcing the lesson that composure and clarity are powerful tools in moments of injustice. The officers escorted him out of the holding area, and the general stepped into the hallway still calm, still controlled. Each step was deliberate, confident, and unhurried. He understood that every movement mattered, every expression conveyed meaning. His composure continued to highlight the disparity between his professionalism and their earlier bias. As they approached the exit, the general's mind was already moving ahead. He considered the larger implications of the incident, the need for awareness, accountability, and change in how assumptions are made. He understood that this was not just about him. It was about preventing similar injustices in the future. His actions now could serve as an example of how dignity, authority, and patience can address bias without escalating conflict. The door opened, and the night air greeted him. The streets were quiet. The earlier crowd mostly gone, but their presence had left an impression. The general walked to his car steadily, officers keeping pace beside him, careful now to follow instructions rather than assumptions. The city lights reflected off the pavement, and the general felt the familiar rhythm of control returning as he prepared to leave. Once seated in his car, he adjusted his uniform and took a deep breath. He understood the gravity of what had just happened, the potential danger he had faced, and the lessons it offered. Bias and assumptions can create dangerous situations, even for someone with authority and experience, and the way he handled it calmly, methodically, and professionally would serve as an example to others. The officers completed the paperwork quickly, their earlier arrogance replaced by caution and a newfound respect, whether they admitted it or not. They had been reminded that actions have consequences and that authority, when misused, can lead to immediate accountability. The general's restraint, coupled with the direct intervention of higher command, had turned a potentially volatile situation into a lesson in discipline and fairness. The general started the engine and drove away from the station. His headlights cut through the night, illuminating the empty streets ahead. He reflected on the incident, considering the importance of remaining calm and composed even when confronted with blatant injustice. Every challenge, every bias, and every confrontation was an opportunity to demonstrate true leadership. As he drove, he thought about the people he had met that day at the hospital, the veterans, their families, and those recovering from injury. They had faced unimaginable hardships with courage and resilience, and in many ways, this moment mirrored that struggle. Facing prejudice, maintaining dignity, and standing firm in the truth were lessons he had internalized and now demonstrated. The night continued quietly, but the general remained alert, aware of his surroundings and prepared for any unexpected developments. He knew that situations like this could escalate quickly if mishandled, but his training, experience, and calm judgment ensured that he remained in control. The officer's bias had created a problem, but his authority and patience had resolved it without unnecessary conflict. By the time he reached a quieter part of the city, the general felt the weight of the evening lifting slightly. He had navigated the tension, handled the bias, and maintained his dignity throughout. The incident was a stark reminder of the importance of composure, clarity, and professional conduct, even when others fail to meet those standards. He parked briefly near a small cafe, reflecting on the lessons of the night. The world often misjudges, assumes, and acts too quickly, but true strength is measured by how one responds. The general had faced an injustice, yet his measured, calm, and strategic approach ensured that the outcome was corrected efficiently and without conflict. As he continued driving home, he considered the impact of his actions beyond himself. The officers had learned a lesson. The public had witnessed the importance of restraint and professionalism, and those who recorded or observed the incident would remember the example he set. Leadership, he realized, is not just about commanding in moments of action. It is also about demonstrating integrity, calm, and authority when challenged. The general walked back into the station, but this time the atmosphere had shifted completely. The initial tension, the arrogance of the officers, and the biased assumptions were replaced by nervousness, uncertainty, and a sense of accountability. He had returned to ensure that the process of releasing him and correcting the injustice was completed thoroughly. His steps were calm, measured, and confident, reflecting the authority that came not from aggression, but from experience, rank, and composure. As he entered the main area, the officers who had first arrested him avoided eye contact. The senior officer from the Pentagon had called ahead, making it clear that any further mishandling could result in serious consequences. The general's calm presence, combined with the weight of authority behind him, transformed the room instantly. The atmosphere, once heavy with arrogance and bias, now hummed with caution. Even small movements and gestures were calculated. The officers, aware that every action was being observed and would be remembered, the general approached the desk where one of the younger officers sat, flipping through paperwork. He maintained eye contact, not to intimidate but to ensure clarity. He politely requested that all records reflect the truth, that the wrongful arrest be corrected, and that an official apology be issued. The officer, still visibly uncomfortable, nodded and began typing, realizing that this was no longer a routine moment. The general's measured tone left no room for argument. He did not shout, he did not threaten, and yet his authority was undeniable. While the paperwork was being completed, the general noticed a few bystanders peeking through the windows and doorways. Some were recording, others simply observing. Their presence served as a quiet reminder to the officers that the situation was no longer private. Social media and public attention had already started to amplify the incident. Every move the officers made was now accountable, and the general's calm authority set a clear example. The senior officer from the Pentagon arrived shortly after, walking briskly through the station with purpose. He greeted the general respectfully, acknowledging the situation with a few quick nods, then turned to address the local officers. The tone was firm, professional, and unmistakably clear. The arrest had been wrongful. The officers had acted on bias rather than fact, and corrective measures had to be implemented immediately. The officers who had initially arrested the general shifted uncomfortably, the weight of responsibility suddenly evident. They had acted on assumptions, unchecked prejudice, and a misguided sense of authority. Now, under scrutiny from both the Pentagon and the public eye, they realized the severity of their mistake. The general, however, remained calm throughout, observing quietly as the situation unfolded. His composure and professionalism contrasted sharply with their earlier behavior, making the lesson more impactful. The senior officer instructed the local police to issue a formal apology to the general. It was carefully worded, acknowledging the wrongful arrest, the oversight, and the need for better training to prevent similar incidents in the future. The general accepted the apology with measured dignity. He did not seek to humiliate the officers. His goal was accountability and correction, not revenge. By maintaining his calm and respectful demeanor, he demonstrated the power of authority exercised responsibly. After the apology was delivered, the general spoke briefly to the senior officer from the Pentagon. He highlighted the importance of training and awareness, emphasizing that bias and assumptions could create dangerous situations for both civilians and law enforcement. The Pentagon official listened carefully, nodding in agreement. They agreed that this incident should serve as a teaching moment, not only for the officers involved but also for the wider community. Meanwhile, outside the station, word of the incident had begun to spread. Neighbors, passers-by, and local media had caught wind of the story, largely because of videos shared by those who had witnessed the initial arrest. The narrative was clear. A respected general had been wrongfully detained, and his calm, composed response had brought the situation under control while exposing the officer's bias. Public attention added weight to the corrective actions, reinforcing the importance of accountability and integrity in law enforcement. Inside the station, the general remained observant, noting the reactions of the officers and staff. Some appeared genuinely remorseful, others cautious and defensive. Yet the message was clear. Actions have consequences, and bias can never replace careful judgment. The general's calm and professional handling of the situation had shifted the focus from confrontation to correction, demonstrating a standard of conduct that transcended rank or position. Once the release procedures were finalized, the general was guided to the exit. The officers followed carefully, ensuring that all instructions from the Pentagon were followed precisely. Each step of the process was deliberate, controlled, and professional. The general's posture remained straight, his gaze steady, and his presence commanding without arrogance. His actions emphasized that leadership and authority are shown not through aggression, but through composure, clarity, and respect. As he stepped outside into the cool night air, He noticed a few people who had been watching still lingering nearby. Some whispered to each other. Others took notes or recorded quietly. The general acknowledged them subtly, offering a small nod and a calm smile. He understood that the incident had broader implications, serving as a lesson not just for the officers involved, but for the community and anyone who witnessed the unfolding events. The general's car was waiting, and he approached it steadily. The officers who had handled the arrest earlier now moved with caution, aware that their actions had been observed, recorded, and scrutinized. They had learned a critical lesson about professionalism, bias, and the importance of verifying facts before taking action. The general's response had demonstrated a level of patience and authority that left a lasting impression on everyone present. Before entering the car, he paused briefly to reflect. The day had been long, filled with visits to veterans, personal interactions, and moments of pride. The evening, however, had tested his patience, composure, and ability to handle injustice. Yet through calm, measured actions, he had turned a potentially humiliating and dangerous situation into an opportunity for correction and accountability. As he settled into the driver's seat, he thought about the lessons this evening offered. Bias, assumptions, and unchecked authority could lead to serious mistakes. Calm, professionalism, and the measured use of authority could correct them. His career had taught him this lesson repeatedly, but tonight reinforced it in a more personal and immediate way. The streets were quiet, the city bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, and the general felt a sense of resolution settle over him. The officers completed their remaining documentation and confirmed the release. The formal record reflected the truth. The general had been wrongfully detained and corrective measures had been implemented. The atmosphere in the station, once heavy with tension and bias, was now marked by caution, accountability, and a sense of recognition that actions have consequences. Driving away from the station, the general maintained a steady pace, focusing on the road ahead. He reflected on the power of calm authority, how patience and composure could achieve what confrontation often could not. The night had tested him, but he had navigated it with professionalism, clarity, and restraint. The incident would remain a lesson, not only for the officers but for the broader community, about respect, accountability, and the importance of measuring actions carefully. As he drove, he thought about the veterans he had visited earlier. Their courage, resilience, and ability to face adversity with dignity had inspired him. And now he had the opportunity to embody those same qualities in his own life. The wrongful arrest had been an unexpected challenge, but his response demonstrated the values he had spent a lifetime upholding: integrity, patience, and calm authority. By the time he reached a quieter neighborhood closer to home, the city had settled into a peaceful rhythm. The general parked, stepping out of the car and taking a deep breath. The night air was cool, carrying a sense of calm that contrasted with the tension of the past few hours. He walked toward his front door, reflecting on the lessons of the evening. Leadership is tested not only in moments of success, but in how one handles injustice, bias, and the unexpected challenges of daily life. Inside his home, he allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The evening had been a test, a reminder of the importance of maintaining composure and clarity under pressure. He thought about the officers, the public, and the Pentagon officials who had intervened. Each had learned something from the incident, whether about bias, accountability, or the power of calm professional authority. The general understood that the night's events would have a lasting impact. The officers involved would remember the lesson. The public would witness an example of dignity and professionalism, and he would carry the experience as a reminder of how to navigate difficult situations with composure. The situation had been handled without aggression, without anger, and yet with clarity and authority that could not be ignored. He thought about the broader implications. Bias and assumptions are present in everyday life, often leading to mistakes, misunderstandings, and injustice.